Hello and welcome back to Quilt Addicts Anonymous. I'm Stephanie Soebbing. Today is our almost final video in our free motion quilting series where we're going to show you how to assemble everything if you've put it together using Quilt-As-You-Go. We're going to talk about how to square up and get our blocks prepped to sew together, how to sew them together using sashing to cover up those raw edges, and then you'll be able to get your top together and bind it and enjoy it. So let's get started. And right quick before we do that, just a reminder that we do have kits available for this in 4 different colorways. I highly recommend going with a nice solid, because then you can really see your stitches, really learn what it is that you're doing. So that way you are able to then translate that onto a busier quilt later. So make sure you check that out. These are solids from Northcott Fabrics. They're Colorworks solids. It's a really great quality fabric and it's reorderable. So we're going to be able to have these kits for a long time as long as they carry these colors. And if they discontinue any of them, we will make sure to swap it out for something similar. So you can make these from now until the end of time as you develop your free motion quilting skills. So if you find this series many years after we originally produced it, you'll still be able to grab these kits. You also can get the stencil packs if you do want to use your own fabric. We do highly recommend going with those. It is 4 stencils and a pounce pad, so that way you can get your muscle memory down. That is the big thing. You've got to learn how to do the stitch first, and then we can modify it into 18 different combinations that we have done in this quilt. So that is really fun. I'm really excited. I'm loving how this is looking coming together. I've got my entire long arm one together at this point, and as soon as I finish this video, the one that we did with Quilt-As-You-Go is together as well. So it's really fun. My team is really liking how these are looking, and they're wanting to participate too when we start putting these videos out. So I hope you guys enjoy it as well. All right, let's get to putting these guys together. So the very first thing you need to do is trim this down. I really like my 12.5-inch square ruler for this step. We do have a few of them available on the website, but we can get more if you guys need them, so go ahead and order that. Now, what you want to do is you want to measure these. This one miraculously turned out to 10.5 inches this way, but we are at 10.25 going from top to bottom. Almost all of my squares ended up shrinking a little bit as I quilted them. That's a totally normal thing. So what I did was I cut every single one of them to 10.25 inches instead of the 10.5 inches that it started out as. And that's no big deal. We're just going to adjust our sashing length to that as well. So don't worry about it. Everything will be just fine. It'll still turn out great in this type of a situation. If you have weird things going together, maybe Quilt-As-You-Go is not the best option for that because it might shrink at uneven paces. But if all your blocks are going to be the same size, you're going to attach them by sashing using this method, you're good to go. Don't worry about it. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and just square this up to 10.25 inches. All right, now this part seems very strange if you have never done Quilt-As-You-Go before, and it takes a little bit of getting used to. What we're going to do is, since we already have a nice finished back and everything is quilted through, is we have to sew fabric to both sides of this at the same time because we need to add backing at the same time as we're adding top sashing. So what you're going to do is you're going to take your bottom sashing, and this is only 1 inch long or 1 inch wide, and that's the width it's supposed to be in order for all your seam allowances to be tucked under and have batting meet nice and neat in the center. So what you're going to do is you're going to center this. And remember, these were cut according to the pattern at 10.5 inches. So it's going to be a little bit longer because I cut mine down to 10.25 because all my squares shrunk a little bit while I was sewing. So what I like to do during this step is use these Quilter's Perfect clips. And what I do is I kind of line everything up on the back first. And it might be a little hard to tell because I am using the same color for sashing as I am for backing, so that way it's not as obvious from the back where everything stops and starts. But I've got it hanging off a little bit on both sides. I'm just going to trim that up later. All right, so I have everything nice and lined up so that my sashing is nice and even with the edge. So that's perfect. That's what I want. Now I also need to get everything lined up on the top. So I'm going to then, keeping everything kind of pinched together in the back, line up my edges for the top, and then just put that clip in. And I found that this was a lot easier than trying to mess with pins, because it's just a lot easier to take a clip off and put it on again than it is messing with pins and having them come in and out. Now we're going to sew a 1/4 inch seam just right across this part of the seam. We're making sure that we're including both the bottom sashing and the top. Now when you do this step, it's very important to know where your 1/4 inch is on your walking foot. There also may be 1/4 inch marks on your sewing machine itself. So on the throat here, I've got a nice little mark here. You're probably not gonna be able to see it, but it's just a little tiny little dash with a 1/4 next to it. So if I line up the edge of my piece with that, then I'm gonna be fine and I'm gonna be able to sew that 1/4 inch seam, because it is important that we are able to do that. All right, so I am getting everything lined up here, and I'm just gonna start sewing. And we're just gonna go straight down top to bottom. And I will tell you guys, because I ran into this, if you are having trouble getting this to go, it probably means that you need to clean out underneath your sewing machine. You probably got too much lint and fuzz in there when you're doing the quilting part, and it's time to take a look at that. All right, so now we have sashing sewn to both to the top and the bottom of our block on the side. So now we're gonna press both of them going away from our Quilt-As-You-Go block. So I'm gonna start with the top, just give that a press. I also have been spraying this with my spray mister just to make sure it stays super nice and flat. I always have it on the floor next to me. I prefer to do this than put water in my iron, because I don't know about you guys, every iron I've ever put water into eventually spits and gets gross. And I have had Alisos for years now, at least 5, maybe 6 years. And I've had no problems with that ever happening. They're still going really strong. And I've never put water in them. So that, take what you will from that. It works really well for me. All right, so now we've got everything pressed away and we're ready to join it to our next block. So before I start getting everything pinned to the next block, you can see that my sashing strips are coming out a little over. That's because we trimmed our block a little smaller because they all shrunk when I quilted, which is normal and totally fine. But what I'm gonna do is just go ahead and trim off that excess so that I'm working with a nice even piece and make it easier to get everything to line up in the end. All right, guys, so here's where things seem very backwards if you're doing this for the first time. So we have our 2 blocks that are going to go next to each other. We've got our sashing on both sides of one of them. We need to sew this together, and we're used to flipping right sides together, but we don't want to do that in this case, because what we're actually going to do is sew our back sides together first. That way we can fold over this top edge and stitch it down from the top of the sewing machine. That way we can make sure that it is covering our seam line really nicely on this side. So if you've ever done binding my machine where you sew it to the back first and flip it to the front, it's very similar to that, just so that you can see what you're doing and it looks nice on the side that people are going to be paying attention to. So what you actually need to do is you need to grab your blocks and put them together from the wrong sides like this. And then you're going to want to pull back that top sashing so that it's not getting sewn in. And we're just going to pin our back sashing to our back side of our block. It's still the right sides of the fabric together, but it's the right sides of the backing fabric that are together. So it's a little confusing the first couple of times you do it, but it does get easier, and it does get easier to manage the more you do it. All right, so I've got those edges lined up. So now I'm gonna sew, just keep this edge out of the way and sew my 1/4 inch seam going straight down here. Now before we do any pressing, let's just do a little quality check here. You should have your right sides with an open flap that we're gonna deal with next. And then when you flip it over, you should have both of your back sides with your sashing right down the center there that we're gonna press. All right, so this is why we sew that back side first, because what we're going to be able to do here is turn this edge under kind of by hand and get it in place and press it. And we want this pressed edge to just cover that seam allowance. And if you can make it look as straight as it can, so it's about a 1/2 inch wide, great. I did not ever take a tape measure to this to make sure it was 1/2 inch. I just kind of eyeballed it. I made sure it was covering the seam, and I pressed it in place, and then I stitched it down. So it's not perfect, but don't get all, you know, nitty gritty about it, or you are not going to enjoy this process at all. So just eyeball it the best you can, make it work, and it'll be fine. What I do though, before I press it, just to help it hold that shape, is I'm going to give it a good spritz with my spray mister. That way it's a little wet. It's going to hold that shape a little better when I fold it over and press. All right, that's looking pretty good. I'm going to go ahead and get that down and just work my way down. I find that it does stretch a little bit from side to side when you do this. I'm not super concerned about it because we can just trim that down later. This is just to cover that stitching. And if you've done everything right, there shouldn't be any gaps or overlaps on the center here. For this one, because I'm using a different walking foot than I'm used to, there is a slight gap, but it's not going to be the end of the world when it's all put together. It'll be fine. So now we're going to take this to the machine and we're going to stitch this part down. You can use a plain straight stitch, just stitching as close to the edge as you can. You can use a buttonhole stitch. I ended up finding one buttonhole stitch that was very understated, and it was quite by accident. I accidentally picked the wrong one, and I decided I liked that a lot better because it was much less obvious in the quilting. And I like the look of that better. But you also can have some fun with the decorative stitches on your machine. I do like the buttonhole because if you have not perfectly pressed this over, then the stitching just kind of goes over top of it, and it just looks like it was meant to be there as part of the top stitching, as opposed to seeing a little bit of the stitching poke through from below. So experiment, see what you like best, and have some fun at this step. All right, so that's it. That's how you join Quilt-As-You-Go blocks. You're going to keep going until you get your entire row together, just adding it just like we did for this sashing. And then eventually you're going to join your rows using the exact same process, just you're going to have a lot longer strip to work with. I will say this is not my favorite method of joining quilt blocks. I much prefer to just get the top together and then quilt it later, but I have access to a long arm that I can use anytime I want it. And so that may not be your situation. You may need to rent time at a long arm, which can be pricey. You may not own one. You may not even have access to rent time on one. And so you may be looking for ways to finish quilts at home that maybe are big enough to go on your king or queen size bed, and you know you can't fit it under your sewing machine. So this is, I think, a really good alternative to that. It would work with any traditional block. All you're going to do is you're going to add those sashing strips in between. It's always going to be 1 inch, and then that will cover over your seam allowances, your 1/4 inch seam allowances that are inside, because you have a 1/2 inch on either side. That's eaten up by seam allowance, and then you'll have a 1/2 inch sashing in between. So it looks really cool. It's really fun. I think it opens up a lot of possibilities for those of us who don't have access to a long arm. And I think it's a great way to be able to finish more quilts at home and be able to enjoy more quilts and know that you have been part of every step of that quilt's journey, from picking out the fabrics to cutting it out, piecing the top, and then finally quilting it at the end. So I hope you have enjoyed this journey with me. I hope you have the confidence to give some of these designs a try on your next quilt block. and really develop your skills over time. I hope you enjoyed the show and tells where we got to see some of my beginner projects and know that they're not as good as the ones that I do today. And also in the next video, which is our final one for this series, we're going to take a look at the differences between me doing the exact same stitches here on my home sewing machine versus on the long arm. And you're going to see that I am markedly better when I'm on the long arm because that's what I practice on all the time. So what you practice on all the time is what you're going to get really good at. So as long as you can consistently practice, even if it's just for 15 minutes, 2 or 3 times a week, you are going to get significantly better over time than if you just go months in between practicing and then try to do it on a nice big quilt. The end of your quilt is going to look fantastic. Beginning, not so much. So make sure you are practicing consistently. You are going to love the results you have. All right, well, thanks so much for following along. Remember, we have kits available for this. We've got the pattern that you can get that shows you both the instructions for if you're going to long arm it versus Quilt-As-You-Go, because it is different. There's different fabric requirements, there's different assembly instructions. And then also make sure that you grab a kit because we've got lots of fun color options for you. You can really focus on the stitches instead of the fabric. And then we also have the stencils as well. These are actually 2 stencils right here that help teach you the muscle memory, because it's really easy to say, just do a stipple meander. All you have to do is have curvy lines and don't intersect them. And oh, by the way, don't quilt yourself into a corner and it just goes on. So even though this is a very simple stitch, it's one a lot of people start with, it's good to have lines to follow when you get started so your body can learn how to move that fabric around to create the design. All right, I'll leave you there, and in the next video, we're going to take a look at the 2 different quilts, see how different they are when you're looking at my skills on the domestic versus my skills on the long arm. So hopefully make you guys feel better about yourselves, and then we will leave you to it. You can finish your quilts. I would love to see them finished. Make sure you share them on our Facebook page, tag us on Instagram or TikTok. We're at Quilt Addicts Anonymous in all those places. I'd love to see what you have made with this and the designs that you have created. All right, until next time, happy quilting.